Guys, I'm BW. I have won 3 majors in CSGO, and this is Thorin's YouTube channel.
It's well known that I earn money and notoriety by destroying people's fantasies and attempting to impose what I see as reality onto the situation. But ironically, I'm sponsored by esports pools where you can turn your fantasies into reality and they help you do so, and perhaps you can get money as a result of doing so, because they have fantasy esports, but they also have betting. At the moment, they're pushing this aspect of in-play betting, where you can bet live on matches that are actually ongoing on different aspects and different side bets. So there have been a number of roster moves within FNATIC and GODSENT, and in a way, it's like a mini Swedish shuffle, but between the two teams. So Dennis has gone from FNATIC over to GODSENT. He was one of the only players, remember, who didn't go in that particular move last time they did the shuffle. Pronax within GODSENT has gone inactive, famed in-game leader, most decorated champion in history as an in-game leader. The fifth player who will replace Pronax is as yet unknown. It's rumoured to be Hampus from Red Reserve. And Lecro has left GODSENT to go to FNATIC, going the opposite direction from Dennis. And the current in-game leader of GODSENT is going to be Twist. Now, on the FNATIC side of things, they've gained Lecro, they've lost Dennis, they've also lost Olofmeister, who's going to FaZe, and they've replaced him with Golden, who is going to be the new in-game leader of FNATIC. So again, as usual, we'll go team by team on this one. So for GODSENT, Pronax going inactive, right? That certainly seems like the right move at this point in time. He had massive issues as an individual player. He was really in one of the worst slumps, or just has become one of the worst in-game leaders in terms of individual level I think the game's ever seen when you consider the level he was supposed to be playing at. Then you've got to consider that tactically, he wasn't setting the world alight. At the very least, you can say he couldn't find a system that worked well for the teams he was a part of. And we're talking about any of the GODSENT teams, basically, since their one big result at Malmo. Beyond that, they've had all these issues ever finding any kind of real style that unlocked their players. Some of their players have looked better in other teams. Obviously, they couldn't get anything done even when JW and Flusher came back. So it seems like it's the right issue, especially when you add into the mix that Pronax is a player where, first of all, I believe in 2015 when he was with FNATIC, there were already comments that he perhaps had some sort of RSI issue. Already there were rumours that there were perhaps some sort of motivation issues. If you remember, part of the success of winning the two latter majors with FNATIC was they brought in Vugo as an analyst to watch all the demos. They had Flusher at certain times during that year swapped to being the in-game leader, as he would be the next year as well. Dennis came in after Pronax left the team, and the team won 6 tournaments in a row and looked pretty much as good or better, but in a different style of play. And it's not as though they just kept doing everything that FNATIC used to do with Pronax, and I've already bought that angle myself. Meanwhile, Pronax didn't go on to do much outside of FNATIC. So I think that ultimately all factors kind of conspire to make this the right time, I think, for Pronax to go inactive. And either he has to really take some time off and take stock of what he wants to do in his career, or he's going to have to play at a low level. Now, that might sound like, haha, but yes, GODSENT is at a low level. Yes, that's unfortunately the case, because that's part of where Pronax and the talent acquisitions they've made have left them in terms of a team. So I feel, though, as though he actually can't even play at this level at the moment unless he completely redesigns his game and comes back. Now, interestingly enough, Pronax throughout his 1.6 career always had some stars that he could have as an in-game leader. I don't think he's ever had people as good as that realistically during most of his time in GODSENT. The better players have been taken, or they've had more success elsewhere. So I don't actually think that his style of in-game leading was as effective now. I think every style can be effective. First of all, you have to pioneer it, though, and really still be pushing for edges within your paradigm, within your approach to coaching and in-game leading, and you have to get the right talent. And I don't think, unfortunately, GODSENT was ever in a position to get the talent they wanted and therefore fill out his system, which didn't seem to really work in the modern day anyway. I think he had a kind of limited grasp on what he wanted to do, and there's a reason why you look at the players from that era, and most of the people from that era, Happy included, people in Virtus Pro, their in-game leading style currently is not really in vogue and isn't really lighting up the meta as we speak. Then you've got to look at the fact that they've lost Lecro. Now that in itself is a killer. Like, that is really tough, because Lecro did look like the best player in GODSENT for pretty much the entire period, even back, I think even when they had Flusher and JW, he looked like, along with Flusher, he was the best player on the team. I think Flusher was probably the best player at the time. But Lekros looked like the clear talent in the team. They haven't been able to make fantastic use of him within their team. I think someone like NIP should probably have considered him. Him going to FNATIC, I think, is a big blow to GODSENT. With that said, though, adding Dennis, if that's the real swap that you're making, that's a pretty good swap. Because ultimately, I think Dennis was pretty good the whole time at FNATIC. He never really looked like he was in a proper slump. His style kind of defined FNATIC. He obviously, in LGB and FNATIC, has played in very loose teams. He seems to like that style of play. He seems to like individual play over structured team Counter-Strike. So I think that will be interesting if they're going to make a switch away from the Pronax style to more of an open style, especially because when you consider that Twist is going to be the in-game leader. Now, that does sound quite ridiculous. It does make me wonder how will that work. But first of all, Twist has played with Pronax a lot of his career, so he's learned presumably from Pronax. He's seen that style of play. He's also played in FNATIC when obviously they had a very different style of play. In fact, he played with Dennis at the time in FNATIC. And he's obviously played with Dennis also in LGB. So actually, Twist has been all over the place in terms of those two in-game leaders around them at different points in their careers. Dennis was the in-game leader of LGB in the past. So I feel as though, logically, he should be heading towards a fairly loose style of play, and they should be playing off talent in this team. While it might seem like losing Lekro, you think to yourself, oh, GODSENT's lost out in another shuffle, they're going to get screwed. I actually feel like this is the team, I'm going to go ahead and back this team as the one that I think's actually won this shuffle, and I actually think is going to be a good team. I certainly don't think they're going to be a championship team. None of the teams in Sweden actually at the moment look like they realistically have the trajectory where you can say it's obvious they should become elite level teams. But I think this is an exciting team. I think it's a team that looks dangerous. I think when you look and you've got Twist, who now doesn't even have to be a star, he's going to be the in-game leader, but you've got Dennis. I think there's some decent talent within this team. I think some of them are still confused. I'll be very interested to see what Twist does with Disco Doppler, because I feel like he's a player who's been very limited in GODSENT and has never really found anything approaching to what he had in Epsilon. Admittedly, Epsilon played at a similar low level as GODSENT. I feel like he's still a lost player, so Twist has to really fix it in that sense. But I think bringing in Dennis is very good. I think Dennis can add a lot. I think he's got a lot of veteran savvy. I think if they play a loose style, I think they can be pretty dangerous. I think they can immediately become an exciting upset team who can challenge for a top 10 spot. So I feel like one thing I like about this team is even though there's history between Twist and Dennis, I feel like this is a very fresh mix of players we've got right now. And this, generally, the whole roster is pretty decent. Like, I know Schneider hasn't done a lot in a long time, but he's still a decent enough player. I think he just has to... This is exactly the sort of team he needs to be in. He needs to be in a team where he's not in any way expected to be a star or a focal point, and then he can carve out his own little niche. People forget, even when FNATIC won that major, he wasn't the best player in the team. He had his own little niche carved out. Like, he had good aim, and he had pretty good fragging, but he was more like the guy who would get like some difficult frags and would play like more of a nuanced role. He wasn't really like a big fragger. In fact, that's one of the problems they had at the time, is they tried to have JW as their big fragger in those days, and he famously didn't show up on LAN a lot, and so actually would fall back to Flusher making his game sense plays, and then Schneider having like an efficient and a skilled game, but not like a monster fragging game. And then Pronax's reads, obviously. And that was a lot of what empowered FNATIC back then. So I still feel like you could potentially redeem him, especially within this sort of a lineup. So really, I'm looking at Schneider and Disco Doppler, the players that we've got to figure out what they're going to do with. But there's not as much emphasis on them. There's not as much pressure that they have to be fantastic. So they just have to find something they can do. They have to find something they can be responsible for and a role that can fit them. So I think GODSENT, actually, this is quite an exciting mix. I'm glad that they've finally come out on the top of potentially of a shuffle for once, even though, again, they didn't initiate this one, perhaps. And now we'll go over to the FNATIC side of things. So first and foremost, a move that obviously had nothing to do with this particular shuffle between FNATIC and GODSENT is losing Olofmeister. Now that is huge for FNATIC. Not only is Olofmeister the face of modern FNATIC, I mean, you have to remember, once upon a time, Forrest was the face of FNATIC. Forrest and Khan were the players who'd been in FNATIC for like 5 years, 2006 to 2010. And Forrest left at the end of 2010 and went to play in SK Gaming, and then played there for a year or two, and then became an NIP player. Now you think of Forrest as an NIP player, right? But to me, Forrest will always be a FNATIC player, because that's where he played 5 years. He had a lot of success there. Those were some of the greatest teams of all time. And so I always associate him as the face of FNATIC, but obviously he hasn't been with FNATIC for a long time now, 7 years. So interestingly enough, this is where if Olofmeister plays many more years in a career, maybe one day we won't think of Olofmeister as a FNATIC player. We won't think of him as the face of FNATIC. And that's kind of, it's sad in its own way, but it shows that it's a different era of FNATIC now. Now, I will say, even towards the end, Olofmeister was a good player in FNATIC. He had recovered a lot of his... It wasn't that he was as good a player as at his peak, but what I liked was, at least by the end, he finally looked like he'd kind of come to terms with his identity again, rediscovered who he was, and he was playing Olofmeister brand Counter-Strike, and that was the exciting element to it. With that said, it didn't seem to work as well in the latter days without much structure. I mean, I know they tried to add a little bit in, but in terms of the playmaking stuff, like, they never got all three, JW, Flusher, and Olof, on the same page at the same time. And so it was rather disjointed when they were trying to make plays across the map. JW's were working out, Flusher's was very so-so. Olof's were pretty good, and his fragging was pretty good, but he wasn't a superstar player. And so they actually lacked a little bit of star power, while they didn't lack fragging power in that team. There's a big difference between those, because you couldn't base a lot of the team elements around anyone except JW, really. And the whole point of JW's style is you don't really base the team around him. You just react to what he then does as a team. So I do think it's a killer to lose Olofmeister, just because he's a good player, and because he's a player who's been in the team for so long, and he was kind of someone where you knew what you were going to get from him. But with that said, the positive, I think, of losing Olofmeister is, I think, for some weird reason, he was one of the players, along with bringing in Dennis, who for some reason really did heavily push towards wanting to do this individual loose style of play. And he seemed like someone where, for whatever reason, perhaps because he individually had so much freedom and impact on FNATIC with Pronax as like the main player who could do whatever he wanted, and they reacted to him, he really had bought into the idea that, it seems, that he thought the paradigm for Counter-Strike for him and his teams was star individual players making the plays they want to play, and then people making the correct moves in response to that. Now, that was very good for him individually in the Pronax era. It was very good for them as a team in the Dennis era. But beyond that, when they reformed that lineup, and since then, it hasn't worked as well. They've looked like they've pushed it too far without enough of the star players to make that work. They needed to come back towards the middle a bit more, and they haven't really managed to do that. So I think losing Olofmeister at least takes out one of the hard heads who perhaps didn't want to, or just didn't appreciate that style of play, and allows him to go off to FaZe and do whatever he's going to do. Now, losing Dennis I do think is big, because I think he was a player who I thought was pretty good the whole time he was in the team. He also may well have been someone who was resistant to the more tactical style. That could well be the case. But I think it's not as bad in as much as you're trading up for Lekro. So I think getting Lekro, he is someone who looks like the clear rising talent within the Swedish scene. I even think when you contrast him against the people that NIP got, who were pretty good ones, and Drake was a pretty stable player. I think obviously Rez showed his form in the last few months. I think actually Lekro potentially can outshine all these guys. He really can be the guy from that crop of the Disco Dopplins, Rez, etc. I think Lekro can be the one who actually can become the best player. Now, with that said, he didn't look like he really had a set identity within GODSENT, aside from good fragger, better than most of the players in that team, and generally deserved a better team. That's about his kind of identity. So I think this is his real chance to do it, because when he came in the last shuffle, when he was in FNATIC, when they did that one after the major, that was kind of whack, and it felt like he was just brought in out of nowhere, and there wasn't really a logic to the move, really. And then also he came into a team where you had Dennis and you had Olof, who were these star players who wanted to play a loose style, and they were all, it almost felt like they were like, right, well, we didn't choose to initiate this move, so you're just who's left over, so we're going to do our shit, we're going to take our spots, which is kind of a classic move within the Swedish scene, that the veteran stars get to pick what they want to do in a team, hence why NIP's had so many troubles breaking out of their style and mold. And I feel like he just came in and they were like, right, you just go and listen, this is like G2 with Scream and Shock. So we're going to do our shit, and you're going to go and fill in whatever's left over and try and do the best you can. Try not to die too much, and then we'll evaluate how you're doing in a few months. And obviously, he's a player who ended up being discarded so they could bring back Crims. So I feel like, even though this is his second time in FNATIC, it's a very different FNATIC he's joining, and I feel like this is a FNATIC where he can do a lot, and he can actually be one of the star players in the team. Because the key element is how they're going to tactically change the team, which is that they're getting in Golden from, well, FNATIC Academy / Ballistics if you saw the EU minor. Now that was a team where I have to say, tactically they looked fucking whack at the EU minor. All they had was CT sides basically. Now with that said, tactically on CT side, they had quite an interesting style. They had like sort of a passive style where they had quite good reads on what to do based on what the opponent did. They played a reactive style, but it seemed to work pretty well actually against most teams they played. Their T sides looked terrible, but then again, I personally don't think many of the players on that team are very good. I think it was a very flawed lineup. So I'll be interested to see what Golden is going to bring to this lineup now that he's got some talent surrounding him and he's got some much better players than when he was in that particular team. So I can't say, I mean, he actually seemed like one of the better fraggers in that team as well. So I'm actually interested to see what he'll do as a fresh in-game leader, but on one of the top Swedish teams. I've wanted to see that for a while. They've lacked for in-game leaders and a new approach to Counter-Strike, so that's a very positive thing. But I'm very skeptical about this team in as much as when I look at the players, I feel like there's an obvious star power issue here, worse than they had before. I feel like at least they had some old stars that could play up to that level. Like, first and foremost, the clear one to me is JW was the best player in the past lineup. At the end, that is. And I feel like now is the clear time where you should ride him and he should be your superstar player. Now is the time for JW to finally be the best player, the focal point, the star of a FNATIC team, but do it on LAN and be very good. Because in the first FNATIC, the one that won the major, he was amazing online and he'd have some good games offline, and he'd have some good games against the lesser opponents and the bottom half of the top 10. But against the elite level teams, a lot of times he just went missing a little bit and he wasn't that same superstar, especially his AWPing wasn't as good on LAN at the time. He kind of didn't really have that same level of impact. Now's the time where he could be on a team where he could potentially be in a higher ranking, but be the main star of the team. Because when they had Olofmeister and Crims, I think it was mainly those two and the partnership of those two that took that team to the heights they went to, which is heights they'd never been to in FNATIC before. So JW is a clear person who's good enough right now and who can be a star, but I feel like the other star actually should be Lekro. You look at where flusha is in his career, it feels like, I don't know if it's just an individual slump or if there are motivation issues for him. He's played for a long time and at the top for a long time. But apparently he's one of the people who wanted to make the move away from this very loose style of play and bring in some structure. So ideally for me, the flusha I want to see is the flusha when they first brought in Olof and Crims, because he was actually more a really, really stable lurker at the time. That was one of his strengths. So I feel like with Crims and Olof and flusha having this poor period in their careers, don't expect a lot out of them fragging style, but if they can both be those stable like players that play supportive style at times, hold a sight and just play smart Counter-Strike, which both of them can certainly do, then let JW and Lekro be the stars and let Golden come in and just be the in-game leader but add some fragging. I feel like that's a pretty good formula for being a good team. The problem is I can't see how you become a really good team. It's really going to depend for me on two factors. One is the level of tactics that Golden's going to bring in. I feel like tactics should be the route to get this team to the top because you have to be more than the sum of these parts. These individual players, even playing at their peaks, isn't going to be like a top 5 team. So I feel like tactics have to be how you get the team better and you open up the game for people like Lekro, for people like Crims and flusha to have some impact on the game still, because JW is going to do what JW does and he's going to probably do it with outside of the tactical system because that's kind of his style of play and it can be a very useful weapon to have. He's the ultimate distraction in that sense. I feel like it's going to be tactics that's going to take them up, but what's going to make them good, I feel like, is stability, because I look at the players they have. Crims and flusha, if they get it right, can be very stable players. JW and Lekro, we think, are going to be the more skilled players. Golden, presumably, is going to try and make a supportive core with Crims and flusha. So I think there's a good basis there to have a very stable team, and then tactics can decide if you can beat the better teams. So I actually feel like this team, in some senses, is more like the original FNATIC, the one with Schneider and Devilwalk and JW, flusha, and who else would be left? Flusha. Who am I missing here? Pronax, obviously. I feel like it's more like that team. And that part of what they made that team able to win the major was being more than the sum of their parts and having, it wasn't really tactics as much as it was mid-round reads from Pronax at the time. But I feel like they had a good spread of talent. They hadn't quite figured out who the stars were. So it reminds me a lot of that team. And by the way, that team winning the major was something of a fluke. It was a one-off. But that's more like the team they feel like at the moment. Interestingly enough, is we have another big shuffle in the Swedish scene where NIP is not involved at all. It's actually very bizarre to me, the status they've taken on in the Swedish team. They were so successful early in CSGO, but they've always remained apart from the rest of the Swedish scene. They haven't taken in the LGB players. They haven't taken in FNATIC players. There've just been no there's no connections between them and the other royal families, as it were, of Counter-Strike, the other very good teams from within the Swedish region, which is so bizarre to me, because in 1.6, famously, the way the Swedish scene operated is the top two Swedish teams, whoever they might be, so SK and NIP, or FNATIC and SK, they would always, in different ways, take in the top talent from the other teams, so that the teams like what would be the equivalent to the Epsilons and the GODSENTs of the world, so back then we're thinking about H2K, and we're thinking about the teams that Pronax had, they would take in the talent from these teams and retool themselves to constantly remain elite level teams and challenge for the championships. NIP instead's left in this bizarre scenario where they let FNATIC overtake them, and now potentially FNATIC and GODSENT might overtake them, who knows. I have to say though, if I stack up all three teams at the moment, I feel like the team with the best talent is actually, this is a tough one, because they're very mixed together. As they stand right now with current individual form, NIP probably has the best talent overall. Because Get Right Forest have looked decent enough recently. We haven't seen that many lands, obviously. I think in terms of the teams of the three that I would actually pick to be the most successful, I'm actually liking the GODSENT team of them. I think that's pretty good. But I think in terms of the team that have the most trajectory to be the best of the three, I would pick FNATIC actually. And the reason why is because at least they have a different tactical approach. They have young talent who are going to be in a starring role, and then the older talent, the veterans, can be more the supportive core. I think that's a fantastic concept. I feel like one of Crimson and Flusher has to come out of their slump soon or rediscover themselves in this new FNATIC. So I feel like FNATIC could end up being the best of the three. I feel like NIP currently is just the placeholder best because of the talent, and I think like GODSENT in the next 3 to 6 months can be the best of the three. So essentially in the early going, when they actually get their feet under them. So I actually am very interested to see where the Swedish scene is going to go, because I still can't see which one of these three could become a number one team. It doesn't look like any of them at the moment. It still feels like a weird mix. But I will say, they both feel like at least they're heading in directions where they're taking a firm direction. They're taking decisive action to build new teams in new bold directions and not remain what before NIP, FNATIC and GODSENT were really a mess in terms of the philosophies never made any sense. There was no way to progress the philosophies, and the talent didn't fit the style of play that they wanted to play at that point in time.
What's up guys, this is Jordan Gilbert.